Now there's some other really interesting things that go on in the spiral that are not well documented. Now, so maybe they're out there. There's so little literature on spiral dynamics, it's really discouraging, you know, that the people that have written about it have not written in detail about a lot of the potentials. But that's okay. That's part of the reason that I'm doing this video blog, is to expand that knowledge. Okay, one of the interesting things that I have noticed about how people function on the spiral is there is a major transition that occurs between the legalistic blue level and the orange entrepreneurial level. And I draw a line in between those two because I think that it's really important to understand the difference between what happens in societies that are below what I call the trust boundary and above the trust boundary. So below the trust boundary is legalistic, authoritarian, magical societies. Above the trust boundary are entrepreneurial, communitarian, and potentially global societies. Okay, so it's really interesting what happens when you have a hierarchy. One of the very, very interesting things about hierarchy is that all relationships that are very, very important are defined externally. So it matters who is the president, and it matters who is the vice president, and they have titles and all sorts of paraphernalia that goes around them, you know, that influences their status and their appearance in the eyes of other people in the hierarchy, because that's the way hierarchies work. Okay, you have a hierarchy, you have a top dog, you have lesser dogs, etc., etc., etc. Hierarchies are not concerned with trust. They are concerned with loyalty. You have to believe in the structure. Okay. Trust is a very, very interesting human phenomenon, and it is definitely one of the cornerstones of advanced relationships. Okay, whether they're human relationships, individual relationships, larger societal relationships, trust is one of the key elements that exists between people. Whether it's there or it's not is really key on how people are going to relate. Okay, so I call that dividing line. Entrepreneurial societies basically have trust in them. Either you trust the individual, and in entrepreneurial and above societies, then individuals are allowed to define their own relationships. Individuals can form independent relationships. So what does that mean? Well, below the trust boundary, independent relationships are not the critical relationships. Above the trust boundary, independent relationships become the important relationships. Now, think about the implication of that. There's all sorts of tons of things that flow out of that thought. How we perceive love, for example. What is love in a hierarchical society? Well, love is something very, very different in a hierarchical society than it is in a communitarian society. And my great example that I like to use is why in Chinese films are two lovers always killed off at the end. Inevitably it happens. If there's real love, those, you just know, those people are toast. They're going to die. Well, Chinese societies are characterized by hierarchies, very rigid hierarchies. Even now, they have an authoritarian structure in their society. And if you have a movie, the last thing you want to send out as a message in an authoritarian society is that people have the right to form their own relationships. That's bad, because the people that are supposed to dictate what the relationships are the people in the hierarchy. So now, let's think about what else does trust do to the human brain when trust and formation of independent relationships is a key part of the society that you function in. One of the things that I've noticed is that trust actually is a key thing in making a person rational, because trust is fundamentally a rational response to people's behaviors. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, okay, let's say we're friends, okay, and we don't know anything about spiral dynamics, all right? That stuff, whatever, you know, whoever that crazy guy is that talks about it on the internet, we don't know about him either, okay? What does it mean if I trust you? Well, so we're talking and you tell me a secret and I don't go away and tell your girlfriend you told me something that you didn't want her to know, and so, you know, I didn't tell her and you trust me, okay? That's a rational response. Now, if I go after you tell me something like that and then I punch you in the nose, you trust me less because I punched you in the nose. I had a negative reaction, I punched you in the nose. Okay. So basically, you had a rational response. Your level of trust in me is directly related to a rational response inside your brain. If I do things, which are little pieces of data, okay, that make me trustworthy, then you're going to pay attention. If I do things that make you not trust me, little pieces of data, then you're not going to trust me, okay? And that's a rational process. That's a process that involves your brain, where you're taking in data and making a decision on how much confidence you're going to have in my future actions. Okay, compare that to hierarchies. Well, hierarchies, trust is not an important thing. All the important relationships are defined from the outside. So if you end up with a good boss, you have a good boss. You still have to listen to him. If you have a bad boss, you don't have a choice. You still have to listen to him. You can't win because the important relationships are defined externally. And, you know, what's interesting about the spiral is, of course, once you cross that trust boundary down below and you're into either legalistic, authoritarian, magical, or even survival societies, you know, basically the most important thing becomes loyalty. And what is loyalty? Loyalty is blind trust. And basically it means that we just believe, right? We believe in something, and it's not necessarily a rational response. So, for example, we believe in a legalistic society, we believe in the laws. Whether the laws make sense or not doesn't make any difference. In an authoritarian society, we believe in the boss. In a magical society, we believe in the spirits. All those things are anti-rational responses. Okay? And basically, that doesn't mean they're wrong, because lots of times there's really good reasons to believe in stuff, right? And not all our behavior that we can have can be rational. Some of it has to be belief-based, because you can't figure everything out every time. I mean, for example, when you step up to a street, you look both ways. That's a belief, right? Oh, I'm going to look both ways. That's always what you teach your kids. Look both ways before crossing the street. Well, it turns out to be a very constructive belief, because if you do that, you know, basically you're teaching the child to collect data. That child goes, collects data every time, they don't get run over, you know, you're genetically successful, blah, 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 blah. So it's not a value judgment to separate things from reason and belief. In fact, it's a very important perception to understand how societies and people function. Okay, so we were talking about this trust boundary and why it's important, because basically one of the things that you start understanding is that it becomes a very important organizing principle in relational dynamics in society, okay? Whether trust is considered to be an important thing or not, okay? And that's really an interesting idea, because what you find, or what I have seen at least, is that societies that are trust-based are more rational, and societies that are not trust-based are more belief-oriented, okay? And that makes for some very, very interesting dynamics. So let's think about this. Well, a belief-oriented society, okay? We have hierarchies, we have relationships defined by external factors, you know, people who quote-unquote know better. We have elites, right, obviously, because those are the people that get to make the relational definitions. All those things are very, very important, okay? But they work And hierarchies can be very, very stable. In fact, that's the reason that basically hierarchies have been the dominant organizing principle behind societies for pretty much all of civilization. We go back to the pharaohs, we had hierarchies. And it's only until relatively recently that we even entertain the idea that there would be any other kind of organizations besides hierarchies. And businesses back in the 70s and 80s started redrawing their org charts and coming up with all sorts of different kinds of organizations and flexible organizations, and now we have terms like adaptive management, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an important thing to understand that the idea that there might be something other than being a belief-based individual really is not very historically old. Okay, so there's, you can go back and look at examples, and a lot of the spiral dynamics people have done this. Okay. But what maybe we need to understand is what is a belief. Before we go around talking about reason and belief and how people use them in the context of societies, we need to understand what they are. And so this is my definition of a belief. A belief is aggregated information over time that's kind of boiled down to a nugget that you can believe. Some beliefs are stupid. Don't step on the crack or you break your mother's back. We obviously know stepping on cracks on the sidewalk does not necessarily lead to your mother's back being broken. But there might be other beliefs, right? Look both ways before crossing the street. That's obviously a pretty good belief. And societies have lots and lots and lots of different beliefs. For example, one of the big beliefs that we had was the domino theory. If one country fell, then all the countries in the world would fall to communism. And we spent trillions of dollars as a nation because that was a core belief in our society. We have other beliefs in our society, that we're very independent and free thinking. And at some level, some of these beliefs, not every belief that exists is invalid. There is some truth. But what a belief is that is important to understand, is it's that information is aggregated over time into a single lump. And understanding the history of that belief is very, very difficult to do.